Good afternoon. This afternoon, we're going to try and wrestle with Chinese-American relations, which have been bumpy since the beginning. The first Chinese who came here in any number were Cantonese speakers. That is, they were from the area of South China, and they got a very bad reception. In wonderful liberal San Francisco, they were burnt out of Chinatown twice, but they stuck with their guns. And many of the young Chinese men worked on the railroads. They worked on the railroads that went back towards the east, and the railroad that was coming to meet them in the west had mainly Irish working on it. So two immigrant groups, neither one welcome, actually built our railroads. And then both groups stayed and spread out in different directions. Up in the Delta area of the Sacramento River, you can find the old towns that the Chinese ran away to. There's still Chinese living there. They're small towns. And of course, you have in the big cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, Chinatown itself. In fact, we have two Chinatowns in, actually three, one in Oakland and two in San Francisco. The big one is known downtown as now it's a shopping area to go and buy artifacts. But the one that's out in the Richmond area of the city is actually like the new Chinatown where the Chinese feel more accustomed to living. And in fact, they've got influential enough to have the street signs made over in the Richmond area, both in Chinese and English. And that bothers some of my American friends, Anglo-Americans, because they spend forever trying to read the sign to get to the English-speaking part. Anyway, those are small and little things that don't really concern us today. There is one famous Chinese artist living in our community. Her name is Yun Tan, and I've interviewed her before for Barbara Bundy's Center for the Pacific Rim. And Yun Tan is a famous ballerina, our most famous ballerina. She's from Shanghai, and she was actually found at a international competition in Paris. She was chosen by one of the greatest dancers of the 20th century, Galia Yulanova. And she was given an option and she took it from our great choreographer and Helge Thompson, and he brought her to San Francisco. She has since brought her family over from Shanghai, and her ambition is to, when she retires, to go back to Shanghai and open a school of dance for prospective ballet dancers. But that's not going to get us very far with Chinese-American relations, because they always go to a dead end. Two of the most famous Americans have a connection to China. One is Pearl Buck, and the other is Henry Luce. And what do they have in common? They're both Americans. Well, they were Americans who were born in China, because in the 1920s and 30s, there was a huge move in the United States to send missionaries to China to convert the Chinese to Christianity. The Christian era didn't work too well. The Chinese listened. They already had a religion of their own and a philosophy of their own. You talk to these Confucian scholars, they don't think much of your Plato and your Aristotle when they have both a religion and a way of thinking. They have Buddhism and they have Confucianism. Nevertheless, these missionaries had children in China. You might remember watching with me The End of the Sixth Happiness, a wonderful film with Kurt Jürgens, a German actor, and Ingrid Bergman. And she was taking care of orphaned children, often left behind. As another film, The Sand Pebble, with Candice Bergen and Steve McQueen, give you a story also about these people who were going to China, sometimes marrying, sometimes having children, and the children growing up as missionary children and returning to the United States. And in this case, one was the most famous writer who gave us The Good Earth. Her name is Pearl Buck, made into an award-winning film. And the other was Henry Luce, who gave you Time and Life magazine. He was the editor of both those. And they were very influential in setting policies and influencing people on the nature of American-Chinese relations. So you might remember them. If you haven't seen the film, it's worth renting. And if not for anything else, it has the most wonderful attack on a Chinese farming area by locusts. In fact, many people on the Academy Awards thought the locusts should have won an award because they swarmed over the countryside and they were captured in this well-made film. But that still leaves us without the story of Chinese-American relations. So I looked around and finally I found a young man, who came from an island off of China's south coast, Hainan Island. It's in the Gulf of Tonkin. You might remember Gulf of Tonkin because it's part of the Vietnam War, the war we lost. So it is that this young man wanted some excitement in his life. So he left Hainan and went up to Shanghai. What could be more exciting? And in Shanghai, he saw an American ship because we were coming into those ports, and he stowed away on the American ship. And when the ship left the harbor, he was still on board. And the captain found him when he was already off to sea to return to the United States. So the captain said, well, I'm going to give you a punishment. I'm going to send you to the Baptists. And the Baptists will send you through school. And this Baptist school is down in Georgia. And I should know that place, but I don't, because my father's people were from Georgia. But nevertheless, this man went and studied and graduated from this Baptist college. And then he decided to return to Shanghai and marry. And so he did. And the Baptists gave him a concession. He would have the concession to sell Bibles in Shanghai. Now, I don't want to upset anybody, but Bible selling in Shanghai was not a big business. So this young man joined something known as the Green Gang, which they were crooks, but organized crooks. So there he is, a crook in one hand and the Bible in the other. But he meets the woman that he marries, and they together have 6 children. And so our story today is about this family, Chinese father, Chinese mother, and 6 Chinese children, 3 girl children, 3 boy children. One married the mystique of China. One married, these are the women now, the military of China, and one married money. And they are the Song sisters. The one who married the mystique of China is Madame Sun Yat-sen, married to the great founder of the early Chinese Republic. The other, Mei Ding, is married to the military. She marries and becomes Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And then you have Madame Kung, and she marries the money. Her husband is and has a great pharmaceutical empire in China. And it's that money that goes finally to the United States and is the foundation for the fortune that is going to turn all of these people in our direction. So now you have three very important women. Initially, they had nothing to do with us, but we wanted in on the China trade, and the British wanted it worse than we did. And so when the Chinese Empire denied the British the right to sell opium, the British forced it in an opium war. They forced opium on the Chinese people, never to be forgotten by the Chinese, by the way. And so it was that they moved in that direction. And at the same time, China had a real problem, as we did. The British had organized in Shanghai an international settlement. And there was a rule there, no Chinese or dogs allowed. The Chinese have never forgiven or forgotten. The French, not wanting to be part of anything British, opened the French concession. They, much more a sophisticated colonial power, allowed wealthy Chinese to live in their concession. And that is why today, my friends, if you go to Shanghai, there is no international settlement left. Nothing of us, nothing of the British, nothing of the Germans, all gone with the wind. Knocked down the British racetrack that was there so the British could have their horse racing, gone. Now there is a great museum, the Shanghai Museum. Now there is a great theater complex, all new, coming from a knockdown version of the international settlement. But the French concession survives today. And the reason why is because the French allowed wealthy Shanghaiese and other Chinese to settle with them in their concession. So that when you go there today, you can still find this magnificent French club. It serves Western style drinks. It's a bar. It's been bought by the Japanese of all people and is kept alive and is allowed to exist. And it has the feeling of a French colonial complex. It's like a Cercle Sportif. They had a very famous Cercle Sportif in Saigon, where I used to go to have lunch. And so it is that you have this phenomenon. And when we came and got locked out, later when Nixon and Kissinger came, they came also to the French concession. And that's where they signed the famous Shanghai Agreement. And the Shanghai Agreement, if you remember it, was a recognition by the United States that we recognized the government of the communists in Beijing, and we recognized the government of the other China in Taiwan. It was our two China policy. And so that was our famous rapprochement to the Chinese. But the story is really more the story of the Song sisters and their brothers. So let me explain it to you this way at an international level. While the Chinese had been treated badly here, nevertheless, the war came. When the war came, particularly the Pacific War, and specifically when the Japanese incarceration took place, the Chinese community quickly made big signs in English that said, "We are Chinese, not Japanese." So they were not thrown out of their homes or their businesses, and they were not placed in these various camps we had. That many are located here in the California area and can be visited today. They're kept open as a mark of shame, actually, as to what we did. in an order that was signed by President Roosevelt. And in a very famous Supreme Court case, Kurosawa versus, the court upheld this very ugly anti-Japanese American document. Nevertheless, we're going to go back. You have to keep going back with me to those Sung sisters. Madame Chiang Kai-shek and her husband, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, initially in 1927 beat back a communist attempt to take over in Shanghai. And in beating him back, they drove Mao and his forces, this is a younger Mao Zedong, on the long march off to the northwest to get as far away as they could from the Kuomintang, the army of Chiang Kai-shek. Now, this story is told brilliantly by, as usual, a Frenchman who happened to be in Shanghai. He was the man who cleaned up Paris for Charles de Gaulle. And when he was in Shanghai and watched what was happening there, he wrote a famous book. In English, we call it Man's Fate. In French, it's called The Condition Humaine. And so it is that you have this man who is going to play a major role in telling the story of what happened in the early days when Mao's forces lost and Chiang Kai-shek's forces won. But the larger problem for Chiang Kai-shek and for, until he died, Sun Yat-sen, who had gone off to study in Japan in hopes that Japan would be a helping hand in the new China. Instead, they attacked China and they took over a huge part of the north of China. That was the area they call their own new province of Manchukuo. And they put on the throne there the last emperor. There's a famous Italian movie called The Last Emperor. And it's not a very pretty story about the role this guy and the people associated with him played in betraying the Chinese people. But we, thank God, didn't have a part of that. And in fact, when war finally comes, that is World War II, from their base in Manchukuo, the Japanese then attack all along the Chinese coast. And when they come to the very famous city of Nanking, if you wish, they then carry out the Nanking Massacre, where they bayonet babies, rape women, and kill as many Chinese as they can. It's a very ugly story, and it's very deeply remembered by the Chinese even today. Now, when this happens, the government that is there is the government of Chiang Kai-shek, because by now Sun Yat-sen is dead. So Chiang Kai-shek, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and the rest of the nationalists moved their government way up the Yangtze River, way, way beyond Wuhan, which was apparently the place where this damnable epidemic started. Beyond Wuhan, you come to the mountains. And there you come to a very famous place, the Three Gorges. And it's been at the Three Gorges that the Chinese in recent history have built the largest dam in Asia. And this dam has built a huge lake behind it. Unfortunately, it's mainly a sewer containing area because the rivers in China are often used as an area where the sewage flows freely into the rivers. And above the Three Gorges Dam is the famous city of Chongqing. And it's in Chongqing that, and in the mountains nearby, that the Chiang Kai-shek's forces finally make a stand, because the Chinese who were living there mix with the Chinese nationalists who've come up the river from Nanking. And they are living now in the caves near to the city of Chongqing because they are being, the Japanese who are down near the mouth of the river at Nanking and who have already carried out their horrendous rape of this Nanking and have gone all the way up the river, cannot get past the Three Gorges. And so the nationalists feel safe, but the Japanese are coming by airplane to bomb them. So almost every afternoon, there's a bombing of the city of Chongqing, and the nationalists have early warning and they go to the caves and they survive. Now it's at this time that the Americans really get involved. There is a decision made in Washington, D.C. that the Pacific Theater has been divided now so that MacArthur has the Southwest and Nimitz and his sidekick Halsey have the Central Pacific. So this is an attack on Japan coming across the Pacific and occasionally using an island or two like the Philippines to get there, but otherwise nothing to do with China. So it is that we have to have a policy that deals with this because our British friends are really unhappy. Turns out that the Japanese are at the very gates of India. So we have to have a new command. So we build up a new command and we call it the China, Burma, India Theater. And we give the area to the command of Joe Stilwell, Vinegar Joe Stilwell, he was called in Army circles. And he moves his headquarters initially to India, because to go anywhere else is madness. But he quickly gets out of India and gets into Burma. And we open then the Burma Road. The Burma Road is basically a way of getting into South China, getting up to Chongqing, where we can support the forces of Chiang Kai-shek, who we're hoping will attack the Japanese, drawing them away from us in other areas of the Pacific. This does not happen. The British are very unhappy because they're not interested in running around saving us in the Philippines and elsewhere. They want to retake Singapore, their crown colony. And then when they do go up against in China, they want to get back Hong Kong, their other crown colony. And in between, they want to get back Malaya. They want to save the empire, which we're not interested in at all, saving their empire. So it is that a very famous man named Mountbatten comes to work with us in the China, Burma, India Theater. He's left behind a very notorious wife, Lady Mountbatten. Lady Mountbatten is the woman who's had an affair in India. Excuse me. She is the wife of the last viceroy the British have in India. And she decides to have an affair with Nehru, which hardly amounts to very good politics, but she didn't ask anybody and Nehru didn't resist. So it is, you have this complex relationship. And most complex is the fact that you have Stilwell, who cannot stand Chiang Kai-shek and calls him Peanut, and also doesn't like Madam Chiang Kai-shek and calls her Mrs. Peanut. So already you're going to have a break in relations, but both sides need each other. So Vinegar Joe tries to work it out with Peanut. And what we have here is an old Imperial Chinese problem, because under the older empire, that is the days of the Ming Dynasty, you have going down to Burma, the Burma Road. And this Burma Road is called the Jade Road by the Ming Dynasty people because they're using it to go down and get apple green jade from the Burmese, which has the best jade in the world. And this has been going on for centuries. Before there was ever a Ming dynasty, there was a great Han dynasty. This is before Christ. And in the Han dynasty, they built the wonderful road that reached all the way to Rome. So it was the Silk Road that connected the Roman Empire in the west to the Han Dynasty Empire in the east. So you have all this ancient history of which we're not a part. Remember, we don't have a long history. We have a very short history, beginning in 1609. By then, the Chinese already have 4,000 years of recorded history. So we can't do very much inside of historical terms. All we can do is send supplies. And that's what the Chinese, as our allies, were hoping for, lots of supplies. And we were sending them, and we were using the old Jade Road, the Burma Road, to get them there. And to this very day, you can see how dangerous this was, because in the north of Burma, this country I've been to, there are mountain ranges. And these mountains are very high. They're an extension of the Himalayas. And so what you have is a flight that's very dangerous. And even today, sometimes been flying this route, commercial, you look down into the jungle below and you can see a reflection of some aluminum, which is a sign that there is a wreckage there. It has never been dug out of part of the group that had been flying supplies from India and then from Burma into Chongqing, and it crashed. So it was a very dangerous route and one that we were very careful with. Now we were able to get some supplies up to this famous Generalissimo. And then suddenly Stilwell, who goes from his headquarters on the Burma Road and goes and flies up to Chongqing. It's a very famous story. And let me stop and tell you that to this very day, the Chinese communists keep the headquarters of Stilwell as a major museum. And I've gone there, and it's wonderful. You go in and there's all this memorabilia about Stilwell and his work there on the Yangtze River, working with the Chinese. And the reason for that is that the Chinese communists realized very early that Stilwell hated Chiang Kai-shek. And of course, their major enemy was Chiang Kai-shek. So that was fine with them to keep the museum going. They have sweatshirts with Stilwell's name on it. They have little monuments to this and to that, all celebrating this period of American history in their backyard, the backyard being Chongqing. So it was, the war was on. Stilwell was now up in Chongqing, seeing for himself that our ally, Chiang Kai-shek, was not doing any fighting. All he was doing is storing up these supplies. Why was he doing that? Well, it's very easy, and you can find it in a repository here in Palo Alto. It's at the Hoover Institute. When the Stilwell papers came up for sale, the Hoover, which always has money for things like that, bought them. And as soon as they were in and cataloged, I requested a pass, and they gave it to me, and I went up for a month from Berkeley and went through the papers. And you can see in the papers of Stilwell his agitation, his fury at Chiang Kai-shek for his failure to make the American payoff pay off. That is, here's all the equipment, here's all the ammunition, you have the army, put it all together and attack Mao. And by attacking not so much Mao, but attacking the Chinese through their allies and hitting the Japanese. Well, you can understand suddenly, if you look carefully at the papers, And if you need to read a book about it, there is Tuchman's famous book, Stilwell and the American Experience in China. And it shows you very clearly that Chiang Kai-shek did want to fight, but not against the Japanese. He wanted to first destroy Mao Zedong and his 8th Route Army, which is up in North China. And they, the forces of Mao, are now, in fact, fighting the Japanese because they want to be the first to liberate Beijing, the old dynastic capital, so that they will be in place then to destroy Chiang Kai-shek, who had almost destroyed them back in 1927 when the famous Frenchmen captured them in their wonderful long period of marching far to the north to avoid the forces of Chiang Kai-shek. Man's Fate, very famous French novel. So it was that we get this all together now. Several people have captured this for us. It can be captured slightly in music. The nature of Chinese civilization is, there's this Italian who's always writing books and writing music and writing scores to capture the feeling of the Orient. And he's already done Madame Butterfly, many people's favorite, absolute favorite opera. And then there is his last opera, which he doesn't finish. He dies with the last act not completed. But there's always another Italian waiting to complete. And so it has been completed. It's the story of a dreadful Chinese woman who runs a contest. And if you can figure out her riddle, you get to live and marry her. If you don't, you lose your head. So here are these guys all being chopped up by this miserable, miserable woman. And then suddenly a guy comes and figures out the riddle and solves it and gets to marry this dreadful princess who's now a nice gal suddenly. This can only happen in opera. And so you have a big piece of music that tries with musical terms to capture the nature of Chinese civilization. And the great man is Puccini himself. But you don't have to go to the Italians for this story. All they did when they made The Last Emperor, they gave the movie rights to an Italian because they thought he was a communist. Well, Italian communists are rather strange birds. You know, they wear Pierre Cardin ties and Gucci slippers, and they're not like any communists anywhere else in the world. And so Botticelli, not Botticelli, I forget his name, but the famous Italian filmmaker made The Last Emperor, and now you have this famous Italian composer giving us a wonderful, wonderful opera. But you don't have to go to them. There is in China today a magnificent film director, Zhang Yimou. And Zhang Yimou's career began with a film that you should see called Hang the Red Lantern. It's the perfect film for the communists to approve because there is a house and where a rich landowner keeps 4 concubines. And when he wants to sleep with one of them, he picks out that one and has his servant hang a red lantern in front of her part of the palatial estate, and he sleeps with her that night. And then when he changes partners, the red lantern goes to another part of the quarters, and he sleeps with that one. Hang the Red Lantern is a magnificent film in color by Zhang Yimou, and in it is a magnificent Chinese actress named Gong Li, who is in fact a beauty in and of herself, and she is the lover of Zhang Yimou, and so they make 5 great films together: To Live, Hang the Red Lantern, Shanghai Triad. he steps on a few toes occasionally in the Census Bureau, Censor Bureau, because in the case of Shanghai Triad, he tells a story in which the Chinese version of Shanghai was just as bad as the Western version of Shanghai. In other words, it was a den of iniquity, nothing but gambling dens, houses of prostitution, gangsters like the Green Gang, all these people competing one with the other in this dreadful, dreadful city. And that was not a story that was approved by the party leaders, but it slipped through and it became a Western success, as all of Zhang Yimou's films have been great artistic successes, particularly in the West. You have to realize that the Chinese also know how to make movies. It's not an American secret. And they even have a Hollywood, and they have stars. And sometimes their people make great films that are big successes here. The one that I'm trying to think of right now, Ang Lee, Hidden Dragon, wonderful film. And occasionally the Chinese outdo everybody. They had Zhang Yimou come to Beijing and stage the great Puccini opera in, where else is a setting as splendid as the Forbidden City, the city that was built by the Ming emperors who came north and made this city their city and built the Forbidden City to its specifications that you see today. And these Ming came from the city of Nanking, and they moved their capital from Nanking to Beijing, and then went back to their ancient city. Nanking is much older than is Beijing. And in Nanking, they built a huge fleet. And they're very open-minded. They decided not to go and visit the strange world across the Pacific. It wasn't that interesting. So they never came to see us. We weren't there anyway. But they did go. The fleet left. It had a Muslim admiral, and it went down and explored all of Southeast Asia, all of what was become Singapore and Manila in the Philippines. And then they crossed the Indian Ocean. So here is a Chinese fleet of some 50 ships going across the Indian Ocean and visiting what was then the east coast of Africa, and coming back from Africa with all kinds of wild animals that they have captured. And they want the animals for their famous zoos. This is all way before the famous American. So you see, we are late at the banquet. And then they get their zoos together, and they've already built in Han Dynasty days, and this is before Christ, a Silk Road that has gone all the way to connect with the Roman Empire. And so they have that working, and their enormous amount of energy. And so it was up until the 17th century, actually, that the Chinese were ahead of the West. And who do you think it is who learned if you have this little piece of metal and you put it, it turns always in the direction of? It's called a compass. It was the Chinese. Who do you think it was that by building these magnificent rocket shows that they had, pyrotechnics? Well, they used black powder. Who was it who found black powder? It was the Chinese over and over ago. It was Chinese who had the secret of silk, a secret much wanted elsewhere in the world and which not allowed to be taken out of China. Over and over again, the Chinese were ahead, heavily subscribed idea, even in the West. Marco Polo's famous visit to China and the tales that he brought back to Venice, the great poets of England in the 19th century. I think of one. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a mighty palace build. Coleridge, over and over again. But in the American case, it came through trade. First was their coming to us from Canton, Cantonese-speaking Chinese farmers, and they're staying with us and helping to build our railroad. Then our going back and demanding some place to trade, so getting inside of the British established international settlement, which is now destroyed and gone, unlike the French concession, which is heavily used. And if you go there today, you can see these wonderful Chinese houses, mansions built in the style of Westerners. So if you go to Madame Sun Yat-sen's home in the French concession, it's looking like any home would look in the outskirts of Paris, built exactly in the fashion of. And if you go north, you see the Chinese again. There is a wonderful place in the north called Harbin. And every year in the wintertime, they have a winter festival. It's an ice festival because they're on a wonderful river that freezes over, freezes 8-10 feet deep. Harbin was a city known to a great friend of mine at Berkeley, Professor Gregory Grossman, who is, of course, was the wonderful husband of Joan Grossman, who does live here with us in our area. I forgot our name. In Piedmont Gardens. And it is that Grossman's family knew about Harbin because everything about China was known. And Harbin is far, far to the north. I went there once with a group and I caught a train from a train station in Beijing, train station built by the Japanese. And we zoomed up to Harbin, and there was a field of ice that had been carved. And they built the Kremlin Wall. They built the Eiffel Tower to scale out of ice. And then they put, by drilling little openings, they put electric lights inside so it could be lit up at night. It was incredible. Another Chinese wonderment. The reason Greg was there was an uncle of his had moved there, and restrictions on Jews were very light, almost non-existent. And so the thing was to move to Harbin, because at that point, that part of China was a Russian concession. And Russians' law was very, very light-handed when it came to minority groups. And so Jews were in Harbin, living, making their way, and the city of Harbin itself looked like St. Petersburg. The colors were the blues and greens, the light blues, light greens of St. Petersburg. It had the feeling of being in Russia, yet you weren't in Russia. You were in China, in a Chinese city that happened to be a concession city. And so it is that we found ourselves going there as Americans to see what it was to see, and it was a marvel in and of itself. And nearby was a very ugly scene that Americans knew nothing about. But we could hardly believe it, because outside of Harbin, there are two things. One is a wonderful, wonderful place where the Chinese today are trying to do what we need to do, and is restore a part of nature that we have destroyed. And so what is missing now in the deep tundra, frozen north of Siberia and China's north, are the great Siberian tigers. So the tigers are brought as little cubs to these areas, and they grow into big, mean cats. And you can go and see them. And then you can get into a little armored vehicle, which has a top that slides back. And you can ride in the armored vehicle right up to the And they're following you, these gigantic Siberian tigers. And what are they looking for? They know that in that armored car is a bunch of chickens, and they're looking for their chicken lunch. It's not Kentucky Fried Chicken, but it's chicken they love. And so you throw one of those chickens out of the top, and boy, that cat jumps on that faster than anything you ever saw in your life and carries it away for a chicken delight. And then you throw out another one, because there are many, many of these tigers, both male and female. They're being bred there for an attempt to reintroduce them to the dark forests of North China and of Siberia. The problem is, if you're fed wonderful chicken every day, do you really want to go back out and have to catch it yourself somewhere there in the forest? But they've had some success. The horror story is next door. There is a Japanese, hard to describe. It's an area where the Japanese took prisoners and experimented on them by freezing their arms and then cutting the arm off when it's frozen and seeing what reaction they got. And other awful things I won't describe to you. But the Chinese, who have a long memory, have kept that place going. There are no experiments going on, but everything that was done then is displayed, described, and makes for a horrible visit. Where before in the morning you were watching this wonderful attempt to rebuild part of nature and putting alive again Siberian tigers, now you are watching the worst of inhumanity against inhumanity. But we weren't there. We weren't part of that. We were way down in another part on the Yangtze, trying to get these people to work together. And it went in a certain distance. I'll tell you a story that enlivens the process. Doctors suspected that Madame Chiang Kai-shek, living there in Chongqing with her husband, the Generalissimo, had cancer. So she, having also had to go through the torture of going to a Georgia Baptist college, like all the sisters and all the brothers did. And in fact, when she spoke English, she had a slightly Southern accent. If you could imagine this Chinese dragon lady with a Southern accent. So she decided to take one of the flights of the Flying Tigers, if you want to call them that was going back from Chongqing, flying over the Himalayas to India. And then from India, she would fly to Australia. From Australia, she would fly to California. From California, she would fly to New York. And in New York, she would check in at the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, which was famous in its day for cancer treatment. Now, when she was supposedly cured, or at least had taken the treatment, she didn't go home. She got a cab. This is up on the west side, and took the cab down, still on the west side of Manhattan, to the old Pennsylvania station. Now that station has since been recreated because it was destroyed by the stupid New Yorkers. And when they realized the loss of this great above ground station, they took over the building, which was its twin across the street, and moved the underground portion underneath. And so now today, if you go, you can ride on a good, the Acela is better than nothing, train from the new Penn Station down to a really nice station in Washington, D.C. And when she got there, she got a cab and arrived at the White House, uninvited, unbeknownst to a man known as Franklin Delano Roosevelt and our First Lady Eleanor. Now, can you imagine the Bidens and Mrs. Biden having to, unbeknownst to them, the doorbell ring, and standing there is the wife of the head of the Chinese state. Well, there she was, and she moved in. So that night, they didn't know what to do, but they had dinner. And they served a place for her. They knew that she would like mainly Chinese style food, chopsticks and all that. So they were there, very jolly. The president always had his martini. So they'd had drinks. Then the president got loquacious. He decided to talk to this woman with a Southern accent who seemed to understand English perfectly. And so he told her a story. He said he was having a hell of a hard time. And the ones who were giving the hard time, of course, were the Republicans. And he couldn't get some message passed. He couldn't get cooperation. He just didn't know what to do. And what to do was a really big problem. So he asked Madam Chang, what would she do if she was faced with people like this? Madam Chang had very long and beautiful fingers with very long nails. And she had been eating with her chopsticks, but she put them down. And she took one finger and went up to her throat and did as if to cut her throat. And suddenly, Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt knew they were talking to a real dragon. What she would do is cut all the throats of all the Republicans, and then the problems would cease, would go away. And it was an attractive idea momentarily, but in fact, the Americans have a real big problem with each other cutting their throats. So it was, she spent the night, and I think another night, and then she got into her vehicle, that is a cab, went back to it's very near the Capitol, very near the area that was overrun recently by a little crowd of unrighteous people. And there in this wonderful station, which is still very much kept upgraded, she caught a train back, and she caught a plane back, and then a plane across the ocean, and a plane up from India to China. Now, when her plane landed in Chongqing, it was full of things she had purchased. Silk sheets. Silk come from China, but they didn't have any down there in Chongqing. Perfume, all beautiful items she had bought in her stopover in New York. And this infuriated the pilot because it was at risk of his own life that he had flown her back to Chongqing. And now he realized that the heavy, heavy cargo in the back of the plane was all this crap for her. And so he destroyed as much of it as he could as his gift from the United States Air Forces, which were then the Army Air Corps, to let her know that it was not appreciated driving a bargain in which the junk was carried along with the head of the government's first lady. But that was Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And that was the story she told, even during the war. Roosevelt, on one of those very difficult trips he made, when he went to Tehran to see in the Iranian capital, or the Persian capital, Churchill and Stalin. On his way back from Tehran, he stopped in Cairo. And in Cairo, he insisted on having a second conference. This conference did not involve Stalin and infuriated Churchill because it was a conference in which he, FDR, would talk and meet with Chiang Kai-shek. Because you see that our president, a foolish dreamer in many ways, had hoped to build a peace at the end of war with all the great powers working together. That means with FDR, the Americans, Churchill, the British, the French leader, whoever it was going to be, likely de Gaulle, the Russian leader, who obviously Stalin, and the Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek. And of course, this was never going to work. Churchill knew that, and he was just infuriated at the waste of time. But nevertheless, FDR insisted on it. So there was a meeting, and Madame Chiang Kai-shek insisted on attending the meeting, which gave FDR a sense of who it was who had a lot of influence and control over what Peanut had to say and do. Nevertheless, the war changed and the war went our way. And the British right away made their big effort to lead the forces, if not of Chiang Kai-shek, at least of those Brits and allies, because they had Aussies there and they had Indian army troops. The Indians had a force of 1 million people in their army. Of course, they wanted to use that army to get their independence after the war. And there was a man already demanding that they do that. His name, of course, was Gandhi. And that was going to happen in the tragic end of the British Raj, with partition and the slaughter of thousands and thousands and thousands of Muslims, and the murder of thousands and thousands and thousands of Hindus who wanted their version of India, which they got, minus the Muslim version of India, which became Pakistan, both West and East Pakistan. And Mountbatten is now off to try and recapture those parts of the British Empire that were down in South Asia, which had nothing to do with what MacArthur was doing, our American Caesar, on his way through the Philippines and up, nor with what the admirals were trying to do in the Central Pacific by going right to Tokyo Bay and ending the war as fast as possible. All of which is going to be done, of course, instead by Truman, because FDR, already a very sick man, is going to die down in Warm Springs, and Truman is to become the new president. Churchill is to be voted out of office, and you're going to have a labor government. Oh, the only man who's ever been around for all the other wheeling and dealing, of course, is Stalin, who feels right at home at carving up most of Europe and trying to carve inside of much of Asia. But he was not to have his way there, because the American Caesar, who became the man who ran Tokyo and Japan as our viceroy, was determined not to have anything to do with the Russians and refused to allow them to be part of the government, the Allied government in Tokyo, refused to allow and to recognize any of their claims on anything. And so it was that they were shunned, but they did take 4 of the islands that were Japanese, the Kuril Islands in the north, and have them to this very day. A series of islands that have bugged the Japanese, and they've tried to get them back. But the Russians are hard to deal with, as we'll find next week when I talk about Russian-American relations. But now we're back. We're in Chongqing. We do get movement, and the forces that are there are moving down the Yangtze, trying to be the first to recapture Shanghai, and with Shanghai then to move north towards Beijing, while the communist forces in the 8th South Army is moving as fast as possible to enter Beijing and take it. And they are the first to get there and to throw the Japanese out, to rout the army, to take Manchukuo back as Manchuria and make it part of China again. All this is to be done, and in great speed. So the war looks like it's coming to a close. The Japanese are about to receive the terrible and mighty blow from the University of California, Berkeley at first, a very famous physicist working with other physicists like Dr. Teller and, of course, Fermi, the very famous Italian, and all the British scientists. Together, they put together the bomb at Alamogordo. And while our van wanted very much for it to be dropped on an isolated island, Truman went with the idea of dropping it on a Japanese island. And so Big Boy and Little Boy, the two nuclear bombs, fell on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And the war was over. And there were the Americans still with their Chinese connection down trying to make part of this whole system work. Well, it wasn't going to work because Chiang Kai-shek was right about one thing. As soon as the war that we were fighting was over, the Chinese war was to go on. That is, the nationalist Chinese, who had won back in 1929 and driven the communists out of Shanghai in their long march north, were now faced with a very powerful force that had already had contacts with the Americans, the forces of Mao Zedong. And this group were not to tolerate any other group in the Asian part that was Chinese. And so they quickly sent a force down and beat the forces of the nationalists. And the nationalists gathered together what forces they could, and they went into retreat by joining, usually using the British to help them, to flee offshore to the island of Taiwan, which is still today the independent nation of Taiwan. It used to be called in the old days by the Europeans and us Formosa, is now Taiwan with its capital at Taipei. And Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang Kai-shek fled there. Madame Chiang Kai-shek made sure, before she fled, that all the treasures that were in the Forbidden City, and there were many, Ming Dynasty, Sung Dynasty, all the great pieces of porcelain, all the great artwork, Chinese beautiful works, were all crated up and shipped to Taiwan. And in fact, if you go to Taiwan today, up on Grass Mountain, there is a museum that Madame Chiang Kai-shek had built. And it's full of all the treasures that the communists want back and haven't gotten back yet. All these treasures from the Forbidden City and elsewhere. Everything that Madame Chiang Kai-shek could lift or steal, she did and brought them to Taiwan. The funny comeuppance for her was that when Chiang Kai-shek finally died, as all people do, Madame Chiang Kai-shek was still there, museum still there. We were there with our famous 7th Fleet guarding the Taiwan Straits so that the Taiwanese are protected by us, the famous American connection. But it turns out that when Chiang Kai-shek was living in the Soviet Union, which was way back, he had married another woman before Madame Chiang. And with this woman, he had a son. And the son had been raised by the communists. And now the son took over as president of the Kuomintang and of Taiwan. And he booted Madame Chiang Kai-shek out of the island. So where to go? She can hardly go back to communist China. So she goes where the money went. In her day, when she was all powerful, her brother, TV Song, became Minister of Finance for the Chinese nationalist government, the Kuomintang. And because he was ambassador to the US, he was able to enter the country without being searched. And he brought millions and millions and millions of dollars back, particularly the huge fortune that belonged to the other sister who had married the big pharmaceutical empire. And she had bought a very big estate out on Long Island. So Madame Chiang Kai-shek picks up everything she's got, is booted off of Taiwan, and goes to live with us on Long Island with her sister. It's really amazing. And then she takes up calligraphy, and she's invited by the Asian Museum here in San Francisco to put on the display. And she flies out here, and I met her, and there she was in all her splendor, a dragon lady of the first water. Her calligraphy was not bad. It wasn't great. It wasn't as great as some that you see, but it was amazingly good. And she made the rounds of the entire establishment. And by then we had two powerful senators, not Boxer and Einstein, who have not been ever powerful, and both have been rather poor senators in my estimation, particularly Boxer. But we did have in those days Senator Knight, Goody Knight, and Senator, what was his name? I can't remember now. It doesn't matter. We had two Republican senators, and they were very formidable, and they were the head of the China lobby. And the China lobby was very pro-Taiwan and very anti-Beijing under the communists. And so now you have California's political establishment siding and Madame Chiang visiting. So it's a heyday for her. But then she returns, of course, to Long Island, to this wonderful estate where she can live out her life in America's glory, supported by these powerful senators, by a huge lobby group known as the China lobby. And so it is, the American establishment cast its fate with a group that only Nixon later could betray by then sending Nixon on a secret mission to Beijing to form a new relationship with China, the two-China policy. But this is enough of this. You have a feel already for our relationships through the Sung dynasty. The Sung dynasty are these three women and three men who were part of Pappy and Mammy. Mammy, she was called, like a Southern Mammy, in their very wonderful collaboration with the Americans and our work with them. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week when we'll talk about Russian. You know the Russians, the one who are always breaking our codes. Talk to you soon. Thanks for listening tonight.